Welcome to Oppenheimer, Science Mission Legacy. In this episode, we will connect the accomplishments of Oppenheimer during the Manhattan Project to today's Los Alamos National Laboratory mission. We now explore his legacy and the continued interest in his life story, a story that is resurfaced today maybe more intensely than at any time in recent history.
Was he a hero? Yes, I think he deserves that title. But like all heroes throughout history, he was a flawed hero.
You had the drive of wartime urgency. The laboratory under his leadership responded to that.
They came to a design. It was pretty novel and pretty innovative. And because they weren't actually sure it was going to work, they needed to do a test.
And when he's in the bunker at Trinity, he's clinging to a post, shaking, because it's all come down to this moment. It succeeded, but it cost him.
Fat man, little boy, they were not weapons of deterrence. They were weapons to end a great conflict.
Oppenheimer resigned from the laboratory in October 1945. He began his post-war years as a true American hero.
Once the war ends, Oppenheimer becomes a hero. In a couple different senses. He's a hero here at the laboratory because he's done something with their lives, taken their efforts, and made them a valuable contribution to ending the war. He becomes a hero to the United States. He sits on top of this mountain somewhere and he has a specialized knowledge that only America has at this point, and he's America's son.
He played a very pivotal role after the war because he was highly sought, particularly by Congress. The military sought his advice. He became a key player in the newly developed Atomic Energy Commission. He was sought at the highest levels. The question too then follows, was he a hero? Yes, but clearly he sacrificed enormously to be director of the laboratory. The cost was emotional.
Hundreds of thousands of people contributed to the Manhattan Project, but Oppenheimer's name became synonymous with the effort.
The title of Father of the Atomic Bomb certainly belongs to Oppenheimer. One man did not invent the atomic bomb, one man did not build it, but one man marshaled all the forces that made it possible. So I think you have to look at the title of the Father of the Atomic Bomb in two senses. It certainly reflected his wartime work, his wartime efforts, his wartime accomplishments, but it also became a heavier and heavier mantle to bear as the years went on.
It's an interesting question. Was that a burden for him? I think it's this, in a funny kind of way, it's the same burden that a popular movie star has. Your life changes. You don't own your life anymore. I would have to think that was a burden. Oppenheimer must have had moments, quiet moments, where he said, my God, what have I done?
The H-bomb, McCarthyism, and the state of global political affairs changed the world Oppenheimer knew. As a result, many came to see him as the world's most famous arms control advocate during a time of rising tension.
It was clear that the success of the atomic bombs in Japan changed overnight the nature of war itself. In fact, it changed civilization. But certainly the military now saw a new approach to waging war. It changed the game. It was inevitable that the government, the military, Congress would now demand larger and bigger weapons. So at the heart of this was the development of thermonuclear or hydrogen bomb.
You have a grandstand seat here to one of the most momentous events in the history of science. You will see the most powerful explosion ever witnessed by human eyes. This is the first full-scale test of a hydrogen device. If the reaction goes, we're in the thermonuclear era.
The issue of Oppenheimer and the hydrogen bomb is very, very complex. I don't know that it's ever been truly sorted out about Oppenheimer and his feelings and his efforts. What he objected to early on was that question of whether it was really necessary or not. And by that I mean, if you've got a lot of atomic bombs, what's the point? Why did you need an H-bomb? And that did not resonate with the AEC, with the general public, and certainly with many scientists as well.
You know, the 1950s were a very complicated time. They were shaped by post-World War II relationships, the belief on the part of the leaders of the USSR that their cause was righteous and inevitable, caused a great deal of consternation in the United States. And Senator McCarthy capitalized on that. He saw communists under every rock. And so it was in that kind of very complicated environment in American history, very complicated time in American history, that questions about Oppenheimer grew. He got cross-threaded with some very powerful people, and it didn't go well for him.
He became less attentive to those who disagreed with him. He failed to pay attention to, despite warnings, this growing demand for a certain kind of view. He not just disagreed with his colleagues, he did it in a way that was acidic and mean. And that was a dark side of him that perhaps under the pressure and the tension of the years got to him. And that weakened him. And it also began, at that same time, began to isolate him. He began to be pushed off to the side more.
In 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission secretly cut off Oppenheimer's access to classified information. This marked the beginning of a tragic period in Oppenheimer's life and in the nation's history.
The hearing was supposedly a secret hearing, although overnight it became public knowledge. It was a hearing, but it was conducted by a trial. During the entire time, before the preparation for the trial and during the trial, Oppenheimer's house, his lawyers' offices were all bugged. The Atomic Energy Commission under Lewis Strauss, who was his severe opponent, knew exactly what the lawyers were going to say and Oppenheimer was going to do and how he was going to respond.
I think it was to silence Oppenheimer, to discredit him, to make it impossible for him to participate, because he had so much credibility and was thought so highly of. So his opinions mattered. And Strauss and Edward Teller and others wanted to make it impossible for him to participate in the debate on the development of the hydrogen bomb, and they had to come up with some way to discredit him. And so they concocted this outrageous, these accusations that had been long since discussed and addressed and put to rest. And
you have this witch's brew of a government that's paranoid to some extent, and then a defendant who didn't know how to defend himself. But it sort of destroys him psychologically. He's never quite the same person as he was. And so he spends the rest of the time sort of in the hinterland. And the security hearing certainly contributed to these long-term decline, I think, in his both mental health and physical health.
Almost from the time of the Gray hearings in 1954, there was a sense that an injustice had been done to a great American.
I had the opportunity to talk with Kai Bird, co-author of American Prometheus, the Pulitzer Prize-winning biography of Oppenheimer, and the inspiration for Christopher Nolan's blockbuster film titled Oppenheimer. It's my understanding he wasn't offering a lot of advice to the government at that point in time. Why not just make it easy on himself?
Just before the hearing took place, Oppenheimer went in, wandered down the hall in the Institute, and went to see his friend Albert Einstein. And he told Einstein that he was going to be gone for a number of weeks, and explained why, that he was going through this security hearing and his loyalty was being questioned. And Einstein turned to him and said, "Well, Robert, you're Mr. Atomic. Why don't you just walk away? You don't need them. If they don't need you, walk away." And Robert said, no, you don't understand, Albert. I need to use my influence. I need to use my status to try to explain to the people in Washington what they need to do to control these nuclear weapons. and I need to be involved. And I can't do that without a security clearance. I can't brief the president or the Secretary of Defense without being part of this Washington establishment. He rejected Einstein's advice, and Robert Oppenheimer should have walked away. But he was politically naive. He had no idea what he was walking into. And the fact that it was all rigged and orchestrated and that he had no chance of defending himself.
He made powerful enemies who deprived him of his clearance and his dignity. But he continued to serve as the director of Princeton's Institute of Advanced Studies and as an advocate for science. On February 18, 1967, at the age of 62, J. Robert Oppenheimer passed away after battling throat cancer. One of the world's most recognized, influential, and controversial figures is laid to rest.
I think when Oppenheimer died, the world knew that somebody significant had passed from the scene. But like everybody who dies, it creates a sensation of some sort, and then all of a sudden it goes away. And so the people now who remember Oppenheimer are people like me who work in this field, scientists who owe a debt to his work, early work, and those of us, of course, who work at Los Alamos, who are direct descendants of his.
I think it gives a glimpse, especially to those of us at Los Alamos who see Oppenheimer, the Oppenheimer Fellowship. Here's the statue of Oppenheimer that, just like the rest of us, he was a person.
He was a person, and he was painfully aware of, the weaknesses of all of us, of how fragile we are. A sense of empathy that was a secret to why he was so charismatic later in life. He was painfully aware of the world and of the fragile nature of human existence.
He made his last visit to New Mexico into Los Alamos a year or two before his death. His voice was barely a whisper, and he spoke in an auditorium. And the auditorium was filled with the people, with many of them that had worked with him during the war. To him, he wasn't Oppenheimer, he was Oppie. I can't even go, this actually makes me emotional. Hold on, because I imagine this in my head.
Is again with us tonight. He is now director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton. But I think to him and to us, Los Alamos and he must be inexplicably intertwined. To me, and I'm sure to all of you, it is the greatest of pleasures to welcome him again to Los Alamos to speak to us tonight. Dr. Oppenheimer.
When he was driven to the hill, he spoke in an auditorium, and when he approached on the stage, the audience just rose and applauded. And he gave a voice in a low whisper. He talked about Niels Bohr and what Niels Bohr represented to science and to humanity. And when he finished, the audience clapped for 10 minutes.
You almost made me forget my honor. Thank you for that wonderful welcome. And thank you, Dr. Bradbury, for what you said and all you didn't say. I'm very glad to be back. I know there are many old friends in this hall. And I know that the things that I am to talk about are very close to all your hearts.
The point here is not just that these were his people, the people that called him Oppie. He came back home. This, of all the places he had lived, of all the places he had visited, of all the places that he had enjoyed, he had come back to New Mexico. He had come back to the hill. He had come back home.
Oppenheimer's story doesn't end quite yet. On December 16, 2022, the Department of Energy vacated the Atomic Energy Commission's 1954 decision in the matter of J. Robert Oppenheimer. This was done, in the words of Secretary Jennifer Granholm, to correct the historical record and honor Dr. Oppenheimer's profound contributions to our national defense and the scientific enterprise at large.
After the loyalty hearings, there have been a number of efforts to kind of redress that wrong. Beginning at the time, actually, with a petition that was signed by many of the lab's staff requesting that his clearance be reinstated. And then in the early 60s, an offer was actually made to do that. He was invited to dinner at the White House and asked if he wanted his clearance reinstated. And actually he said something to the effect of, "Hell no, are you crazy?" And so instead, he was awarded the Fermi Prize, the Fermi Medal.
When they came here, they knew nothing. They didn't know where they were going. My father had just enlisted in the Army. He was then told to go home and report to Santa Fe at 109 East Palace.
Retired U.S. Senate staffer Tim Reeser spent years trying to rectify the damage caused by the security hearing.
It was both a personal thing because of my connection through my parents, but also just a matter of a travesty of justice that had been perpetrated by the government. Well, it was really thanks to Kai, who I had met many years before, who told me about the work, the efforts that he and Marty Sherwin had made previously to try to convince the Department of Energy to deal with what had happened and to recognize just how unfairly Oppenheimer had been treated and the need to rectify that. And it just sort of faded from anyone's attention other than Kai and Marty, who continued to try to find somebody who would take this on, and that's when I got involved. I decided that when President Biden was elected, that we should revisit this.
Tim is the most effective man on Capitol Hill for the last 38 years. He knows how the levers of Congress work, and he took this on and found a way to make it happen. And it's an incredible decision. I was stunned when I got a call from Tim in December saying, "We did it. The Secretary of Energy is issuing a press release this afternoon." It's very rare that any government anywhere in the world will ever apologize or take back a decision. But this happened, and again, I think it sends a good message to the history books, to young people who are going to read this story, and they'll see, well, it ended well in a way for Robert Oppenheimer. He was exonerated.
On her visit to Los Alamos, DOE Secretary Jennifer Granholm spoke about the importance of vacating the Oppenheimer hearings.
The due process component of this hearing was such a railroad, and it was clearly a decision that was made by Strauss to find the outcome they wanted, as opposed to having it be the truth. And I think it was super important for our DOE community, for our lab community, but for, to the extent that others followed this, for scientists around the country to say, to know that truth prevails and that we want scientists to openly question and to openly speak up and that we have their back.
It's nice to have a gesture like that, and it was something the family didn't advocate for as much as scientists did. In my whole life, when I met scientists, they said, "We think this is really important for the scientific community," and I think that that's potentially a direct outcome of not telling scientists that your opinion doesn't matter, that your advice isn't important, and this could be a period that is going into the next stage of respect for big science and the legacy that my grandfather had. So it's painful to go through those things in the family. Robert Oppenheimer didn't complain. Really, he didn't complain about anything, and it wasn't something that we did in the family saying we demand an apology. But being given one to forgive is divine, so it's unambiguously accepted and thanked.
I reached out to my colleagues, the former directors of this lab, who'd also been contacted in many cases to write letters of support. We were absolutely unanimous that it would be entirely appropriate for the Secretary of Energy, who has the authority to do this, to basically wipe the slate clean or vacate the results of the hearing and basically apologize for the actions that were taken. He deserved better of his country, and that's what the vacation is in my mind.
You know, Oppenheimer was such an unusual person. I hope that he would feel the same way, that, you know, albeit awfully late in coming, been relieved that people understood that, you know, what happened to him was really outrageous, and he was loyal, he was trustworthy, all the things that hearing attempted to discredit him for not being. In fact, he was a loyal American. He gave everything to the success of what he was asked to do. And, you know, he did so in a way that I think everyone should feel proud of. And so, you know, I think he would have at least been glad that his own reputation, his integrity, his loyalty were reaffirmed.
It's also important from the perspective of people today for, you know, two maybe important points. One is that I see the Secretary's decision as sending a message to clearance holders that they can and should expect just treatment in matters of security clearances from their government, that that's a reasonable expectation, and that the government holds that expectation of itself as well. I think that's an important message to people. I think there's a second message buried in there, and I think what this decision does, it does not indicate to people that even for the greats, anything less than the truth is acceptable in the security arena.
Part of Oppenheimer's legacy that's often forgotten is his laboratory. Los Alamos was created in early 1943, and it endures to this day. We continue to remember Dr. Oppenheimer here and to be inspired by the work that he did in his nation's interest during some of the most dangerous days of World War II.
It's that moment in time in which history changed in a second. Not even in a second, in a millisecond. And that millisecond that changed the world in history, not just militarily, but from now on, the world was going to have access increasingly to the power of the sun. That started here on this mesa by the people who came during the war and who even now on that hill out there are still doing the same work. That's what it matters.
And I think that the environment we have today is part of the legacy that Oppenheimer left for us. He created this environment, and it works.
The story of the diversity and the complexity of the project, I think that's something that sometimes gets lost. It seems that there's this simple timeline. You know, we thought of the weapon, we designed the weapon, we tested Trinity, somehow or another we got the weapons to the Pacific, we dropped the bombs, we ended the war. The real story is the diversity and the complexity of the project and everything that had to be done by all these people to make the project a success.
I think the first takeaway I have from Oppenheimer that I would hope people would get is that we owe him a scientific debt of gratitude, we owe him an organizational debt of gratitude, but we're here today doing this work, contributing to the nation because of what he started and what he fostered, what he nurtured, and that has come forward in time. That legacy is ours because of his.
For those in the future, you know, students and scientists and anyone who cares to learn about Oppenheimer and what he did and who he was, part of the story is that the government didn't just forget about what happened, and recognizing and appreciating who he was and what he contributed, and that he never should have been subjected to what happened in 1954, and that it was important to take, a tangible step to make that point. It wasn't just enough to recognize it, to talk about it, to understand it. It was important to actually do something about it.
It's interesting that he was somebody who, recognized his duty during war. He didn't shirk away from that. He wasn't a total pacifist. He was interested in helping in a war and ushering technology into the world that he fully understood would be very powerful. His insight into what could be the outcome of that work. And for them, theoretical physicists, they're seeing many steps ahead. They saw that we couldn't have war in the same way. And the answer, if you understand that you can't have wars the same way, you actually would not spend a lot of time building up huge weapon systems and pointing them at each other. You would say, we're kind of forced into this new level of cooperation that we've never had before. And when he said that in kind of poetic and historical terms to leaders, I think he meant it. And he's not the only one with that insight. It's the root of all philosophy and all religions. They all say the same thing, that we have to kind of get along with people that we would have considered our enemy in the past.
It is not just nuclear weapons. The kind of discoveries within Los Alamos ranges from biology, isotopes for medical purposes, material science for structural materials. Scientists from all over the world come here at Los Alamos National Laboratory. We are unique in terms of the breadth of science that can be done in one place.
We can design and fabricate and diagnose high precision experiments in a way that was virtually inconceivable even 10 years ago. And moreover, we can simulate those experiments with a fidelity that continues to grow exponentially just by leaps and bounds and dwarfs anything that was possible even just a few years ago.
There was a huge fear that, given the fact that the underlying physical principles were universally known and understood, that anyone with sufficient determination and skill could make a bomb. So we don't quite have the urgency of the Second World War. I would say there is a sense of urgency and importance to our mission that at least is a close cousin of what was present in the 1943 to 1945 period.
Oppenheimer was a complex person with a complex legacy. He faced great adversity, sometimes at his own making, but persevered. In doing so, Oppenheimer helped change the world. His science expanded our understanding of nature. His mission helped end history's most deadly war. And his legacy continues to inspire his laboratory.